The grand ballroom shimmered with the light of 1,000 crystals, but the heart of its host, the young and notoriously pragmatic billionaire Julian Gray, was made of ice. That night, surrounded by the city's elite, he made a shocking announcement, a challenge laced with cynicism. "Play me something that can truly touch my soul, and I will make you my wife." It was a cruel, impossible game, designed to prove that genuine emotion was a currency he could never be forced to spend. But what happens when a forgotten pianist with a broken heart and nothing left to lose accepts his challenge? If you believe that music can heal, that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that even the coldest hearts can be thawed, then please take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the soul, and comment below with the words, "Love is a melody," if you're ready to hear their story unfold. Our story begins within the gilded walls of the Greystone Manor, a place that felt more like a museum than a home. It was a night of the annual Gray Foundation Charity Gala, an event Julian Gray hosted not out of generosity, but out of obligation. To him, it was merely another transaction, an investment in public perception. Julian, the architect of financial empire built before he'd turned 30, moved through the crowd with an effortless grace that belied a profound detachment. His suit was impeccable, his features were chiseled, but his eyes held the cold, calculating glint of polished steel. He saw the world not in colors, but in numbers, not as a network of human connection, but as a series of assets and liabilities. And to Julian, love was the greatest liability of all, an unpredictable variable in a life he had meticulously controlled. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of polite, calculated conversations. People laughed, but their laughter didn't reach their eyes. They complimented him, but their words were just carefully crafted proposals disguised as praise. Julian felt a familiar wave of boredom wash over him. This was his world, an orchestrated symphony of wealth, a velvet-gloved cage where everything was beautiful and nothing was real. It was in this moment of deep-seated cynicism that a reckless idea sparked within him. He wanted to shatter the facade. He wanted to prove, once and for all, how hollow this world truly was. Excusing himself, he walked to the small, elevated stage where a magnificent grand piano sat, silent and waiting. Tapping the microphone, he drew the attention of every guest. A hush fell over the room. "Good evening," he began, his voice smooth as silk yet sharp as glass. "Tonight, we celebrate art and philanthropy. But as I look around, I find myself unimpressed. It all feels rehearsed." He paused, letting the tension build. "So, let's make this evening interesting. I will offer a prize beyond money, beyond status. To any woman in this room who can come to this piano and play something that genuinely moves me, I will offer my hand in marriage." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom, followed by nervous, disbelieving laughter. It had to be a joke. A cruel, arrogant game for a man who had everything and valued nothing. They saw it as the ultimate display of power, dangling the one thing he would never give away, marriage, like a prize he knew no one could ever claim. Julian's lips curved into a faint, self-satisfied smile. He was certain no one could win his game. He had built walls of ice around his heart so thick, he believed them to be unbreakable. He was wrong. As Julian's audacious words echoed through the silent ballroom, they were met with a flurry of whispers and scornful smiles. Socialites in glittering gowns saw a game of status, while aspiring artists saw a shortcut to fame. But in a quiet, shadowed corner, far from the center of attention, one woman heard something else entirely. Her name was Stella. She didn't belong here. Her simple, dark blue dress, though elegant, was a whisper in a room of shouts. She clutched a small, worn handbag, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the floor as if the intricate patterns of the marble were the most interesting thing in the world. She was trying to make herself invisible, a ghost at the feast. There was a time when Stella's name was spoken with reverence in the hallowed halls of the country's most prestigious music conservatory. A prodigy, they called her. Her fingers didn't just play the notes. They told stories, painting landscapes of joy and sorrow on the ivory keys. She was destined for the world's grandest stages, her future a brilliant symphony waiting to be composed. But fate, in its cruelest form, had conducted a different piece for her. A sudden, devastating loss had shattered her world. In the deafening silence that followed, her music died. The passion that once burned so brightly was extinguished, leaving behind only the cold ashes of self-doubt. Now, she made a quiet living teaching piano to children, her days filled with simple scales and nursery rhymes, a pale echo of the complex masterpieces she once commanded. She was only here tonight because her best friend, tired of seeing her hide from the world, had practically forced her into the dress and pushed her out the door. Just for one night, Stella, she'd said, remember what it feels like to be surrounded by beauty. But to Stella, this wasn't beauty. It was a painful reminder of the life she had lost, the person she had failed to become. When Julian made his announcement, she didn't hear the arrogance or the promise of a wedding. She heard the challenge of a man who, like her, seemed to believe that true, honest emotion was a myth. His cynicism was a mirror to her own despair. He was daring someone to prove that a heart could still be moved, that a soul could still be touched. And as she looked at the magnificent piano on the stage, a forgotten, painful ache resonated deep within her chest. It was the ghost of her own music, stirring from its long slumber, faintly calling her name. Julian's challenge, as absurd as it was, hung in the air like a charged particle, and in a room full of ambition, it was an invitation that couldn't be ignored. The first of the stage was a young socialite, known for her conservatory training. She played a complex classical piece, her fingers flying across the keys with flawless, machine-like precision. Each note was perfect, but it was a perfection of a photograph, lacking the breath of life. Julian watched his expression unchanged before giving a slight, dismissive nod as she finished. Technique, he murmured to no one in particular. How very predictable. Another followed, a jazz musician who tried to win him over with a loud, dramatic improvisation full of flair and fury. It was passionate, but it was a performance of passion, not the real thing. It was hollow, and Julian could hear the emptiness in every chord. With each failed attempt, Julian's cynical smile grew wider. His point was being proven before the very eyes of the city's elite. He leaned back in his chair, a king on his throne, watching with detached amusement as these people paraded their soulless art before him. His gaze swept across the room, a silent dismissal of everyone and everything in it. And then he saw her. Tucked away in the shadows, almost completely hidden, was Stella. In a sea of faces straining for his attention, hers was turned away, fixed not on him, but on the piano, and in her eyes, he didn't see ambition or greed. He saw a universe of sorrow, a quiet longing so profound it seemed to absorb the light around her. She was an anomaly, a whisper of authenticity, in a room deafened by pretense. A new, crueler game sparked in his mind. This was far more interesting. He rose from his seat, and the room fell silent once more. He didn't look at the musician who had just finished playing. He looked past them, his eyes locking onto the woman in the simple blue dress. The crowd followed his gaze, parting slowly as he began to walk toward her, his steps deliberate and soundless on the plush carpet. He stopped directly in front of Stella, forcing her to finally meet his gaze. "I've heard enough noise tonight," he said, his voice low but carrying an unnerving intensity. You've been staring at that piano as if it holds the answer to some secret. Do you actually have something to say with it, or are you just another silent critic in the shadows?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every person in the room heard it. "The offer stands. Make me feel something, and a wedding is what you'll get, but if you can't, then don't waste any more of my time." For a paralyzing moment, the world dissolved into a single, sharp point of focus. The cold intensity in Julian Gray's eyes. Every sound in the grand ballroom, the rustle of silk, the clinking of ice in a forgotten glass, the collective held breath of the crowd, faded into a distant, meaningless hum. Stella felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but as were the only ones that burned. Her first instinct was a primal urge to flee, to turn and melt back into the shadows, to go back to her quiet, safe, colorless life. Marriage? The word was a bitter joke in her mind. This wasn't a proposal. It was a public execution of her dignity, and he was a gleeful executioner, wielding his power and wealth like an axe. He was a cruel, bored man, and she was to be his next fleeting amusement. Every fiber of her being screamed to say no. But as she held his gaze, ready to utter the refusal that would send her back to her obscurity, she saw something flicker beneath the surface of his arrogance. It wasn't kindness or warmth. It was something far colder and far more familiar. A void. She saw a profound, cavernous loneliness in his eyes, the look of a man starving in the middle of a feast, and his challenge to feel something was not a taunt, but a desperate, perhaps even subconscious, cry from a man who had forgotten how. Suddenly, the challenge was no longer about him. It was about her. The polished floor beneath her feet seemed to fall away, and for a heart-stopping second, she was no longer in a ballroom. She was a girl again, her small hands dancing across the keys of her family's worn upright piano, the afternoon sun streaming through the window as her father listened, his eyes closed in a serene smile. Music wasn't a performance then, it was breathing. It was a language she spoke when words failed, the only way she knew how to make sense of the world. Then another memory, sharp and cruel as shattered glass, pushed its way forward. The sterile white walls of a hospital room, the rhythmic, electronic beep of a machine, and her fingers numb and clumsy, playing a soft lullaby on a cold windowsill for the last time. After that day, the music had stopped. The piano became a monument to her grief. To touch the keys was to touch the rawest nerve of her pain. Fear, cold and suffocating, wrapped around her heart. Julian was asking her to do more than just play the piano. He was asking her to walk back into the ruins of her own life, to face the ghosts she had spent years trying to forget. What if she tried and nothing came out but discordant noise? What if she discovered that the music inside her wasn't just sleeping, but was well and truly dead? The risk of that humiliation was terrifying. But the alternative was to turn away now and know that she had let fear win, perhaps forever. A decision, silent and profound, settled within Stella. It was not a choice born of courage, but of necessity. To refuse was to die a small death right where she stood. To accept was terrifying, but it was at least a choice to live, if only for a few more moments. Without a word, she took a single step forward, and then another. The short walk from the shadows to the stage felt like a mile-long journey across a barren wasteland. The whispers of the crowd were like snakes slithering at her feet. Who is she? Look at that dress. She's clearly a nobody. Is she serious? This is just embarrassing. Each word was a small stone cast at her fragile resolve. But she didn't stop. She wasn't walking toward Julian Gray or his insulting proposal. She was walking toward the only part of herself she ever truly loved, the part she had abandoned long ago. Julian watched, his unreadable expression a mask of stone. The faint, mocking smile was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. He had expected tears or a hasty retreat. He had not expected this quiet, ghost-like procession. This woman, who seemed so breakable, was not behaving according to the script. And for the first time that evening, he felt a flicker of genuine, unsettling curiosity. He watched as she reached the piano bench and sat, her movements graceful but hesitant, like a queen returning to a throne she no longer felt worthy of. She placed her hands on the edge of the keyboard, her fingers trembling so violently she had to curl them into fists. The grand piano felt immense, an intimidating beast of polished ebony and ivory. For a moment, she was drowning in the silence, a silence filled with the ghost of every melody she had ever forgotten and the crushing weight of every expectation in the room. The whispers of the crowd merged with the louder, crueler whispers in her own mind. You're not good enough anymore. You'll fail. You'll only find pain here. Run. The memory of her father's proud face wore with the sterile, beeping sound of the hospital monitor. It was too much. The noise was deafening. And then she did the only thing she could. She closed her eyes. She shut out the glittering chandeliers. She shut out the judgmental stares of the crowd. She shut out the piercing gaze of Julian Gray. She shut out the cacophony of her own fear. In the vast, silent darkness of her mind, she began to desperately search. She wasn't looking for a song she had learned, a complex piece to show off her skill. She was searching for something far more elemental, a feeling, a flicker of the fire that had once defined her. She was searching for the melody of her own heart, hoping, praying, that after all this time, it still remembered how to sing. Her fingers uncurled, hovering over the silent keys. The world held its breath. And then a sound. It was not a grand chord or a dramatic opening, but a single, hesitant note that fell into the silent room. It hung in the air, fragile and alone. A question mark made a sound. Another note followed, then another, each one placed with delicate uncertainty, like the first steps of fawn on unsteady legs. The melody began as a whisper, a search in the dark. It was a sound of quiet rain on a window pane, the feeling of a memory just out of reach. In those first few bars, the entire ballroom heard the story of Stella's solitude, the sound of a heart that had learned to beat quietly, so as not to disturb its own grief. But then, something shifted. As her fingers reacquainted themselves with the familiar landscape of the keys, a new strength flowed into them. The hesitant search found a path. The melody, once a fragile whisper, began to gain its voice. It was not a song anyone in that room had ever heard before, because it was a song that had never been written down. It was being composed in that very moment, channeled from the deepest, most hidden chambers of her soul. The music told a story without words. It spoke of a brilliant, sunlit happiness, which then dissolved into turbulent, stormy chords of unbearable loss. The piano wept, its notes crying out with a pain so pure and unfiltered that it resonated with the secret sorrows of every person listening. The whispers had long since died. The cynical smirks had melted away, replaced by expressions of stunned disbelief. Guests stood frozen, their champagne glasses forgotten in their hands. This wasn't performance. It was a confession. It was a raw, unvarnished truth of a life, poured out for all to hear. Just as the music reached its most heartbreaking point, it transformed again. From the depths of the sorrowful chords, a new theme began to emerge. It was a melody of defiant hope, as delicate and as powerful as the first flower pushing its way through cracked pavement after a long winter. It wasn't a loud, triumphant sound, but a quiet, resilient promise. It was the sound of a single candle refusing to be extinguished in the dark. The music swelled, flooding every corner of the vast ballroom, not with noise, but with pure, undeniable feeling, and held every single soul captive in its spell. Of all the people in that room, none were more undone by the music than Julian Gray himself. As Stella played, the transformation that came over him was stark and absolute. He, who had been leaning back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a bored monarch, now found himself on the edge of his seat, leaning forward as if pulled by an invisible string. The cynical smile, his signature armor against the world, had not just faded. It had vanished, leaving his features exposed and vulnerable. His expression shifted from shock to disbelief, and then to something deeper, a raw, aching recognition that terrified him. His analytical mind, the very tool that had built his empire, scrambled to regain control. He tried to dissect the music, to label it, a clever use of minor keys, a predictable emotional crescendo, but his defenses were useless. The music wasn't a technical exercise to be analyzed. It was a living, breathing entity. It paid no attention to the walls he had built around his heart, flowing through cracks he never knew he had, and flooding the empty spaces he had long since pretended did not exist. For the first time in his adult life, Julian wasn't thinking. He was only feeling. He felt the crushing weight of her loneliness, the sharp sting of her loss, and the breathtaking courage of her hope. And in feeling hers, he was forced to finally acknowledge his own. The melody was a key, unlocking a room in his memory he had sealed shut and abandoned. He was no longer a billionaire in a ballroom. He was a small boy, sitting at an enormous black piano in a silent, cavernous mansion. His fingers were small and tired, struggling to perfect a piece for his father, a man who saw music not as art, but as another discipline to be conquered, another line item on the resume of a future CEO. He remembered the cold voice correcting his every mistake, the constant pressure to be perfect, to be powerful, to be unemotional. He remembered playing flawlessly, his hands producing beautiful sounds that felt like lies, because his heart was silent and terrified. He had learned to equate music with performance, with expectation, with a profound and suffocating loneliness. Stella's music was the ghost of every song he had been forbidden to play. It was imperfect, raw, and bleeding with a truth he had been taught to bury. In that moment, he saw his entire life for what it was, a grand, empty performance. He had conquered the world, but had forfeited his own soul. A painful tightness constricted his throat, and he felt a strange, burning sensation behind his eyes. Julian Gray, a man who had never been moved by anything, was completely and utterly shattered. The final note was not an ending, but a release. It was a single perfect tone that ascended into the breathless air of the ballroom, holding within it the echoes of all the sorrow and all the hope that had come before. It shimmered for a long moment, a delicate star of sound in the vast, velvet quiet, before finally, gently, fading into nothing. Stella's hands, which had moved with such purpose and passion, came to rest in her lap. Her body, which had swayed with the life of the music, became perfectly still. The performance was over. What followed was not applause. What followed was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it felt louder than any sound. It was not an awkward silence, but a sacred one, heavy with the unsaid emotions of every person in the room. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The spell was still holding them, and to make a sound would be to shatter something precious. For a few timeless moments, they were not a crowd of egos and agendas. The hardened CEO, the ruthless socialite, the jaded art critic, they were all just people, returned to quiet truth of their own hearts. A woman discreetly wiped a tear from her cheek. A man stared blankly at the intricate ceiling, lost in a memory he hadn't revisited in years. Stella's music had held up a mirror, and in it they had all seen a reflection of their own humanity. Slowly, as if waking from a deep and powerful dream, Stella opened her eyes. The ballroom came back into focus, but it looked different. The faces staring back at her were no longer a gallery of cold, judgmental masks. She saw wonder. She saw empathy. She saw awe. Her fear, which had been a suffocating presence just minutes before, had receded, replaced by a strange and fragile calm. She had walked through the fire of her past, and had come out on the other side, not unscathed, but whole. She had spoken her truth in the only language she had left. And then, as if guided by a single thought, the collective gaze of the room shifted. One by one, every pair of eyes turned away from the woman at the piano and settled upon the man who had started it all. They looked at Julian Gray. The silence, which had been one of shared emotional catharsis, now tightened, crackling with a new and unbearable tension. The question hung, unspoken, in the air. The challenge had been met. The impossible had been achieved. The entire room, the entire city's elite, was now witness to the verdict. What would the man with the heart of ice do, now that it had been so thoroughly, so undeniably melted? The silence stretched for an eternity, thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. Every eye was on Julian, waiting, watching. The mask of the calculating billionaire was gone, and in its place was the face of a man profoundly shaken, a man seeing the world through new eyes. Then a sound broke the stillness. It was the quiet scrape of a chair leg against the polished floor. Julian was standing. He didn't rise with his usual smooth, predatory grace, but with a rigid, almost pained slowness, as if a great weight was pressing down on him. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the only sign of the war raging within him. He took a step toward the stage, and then another. The crowd, a silent, breathing entity, parted for him, creating a path from his world of cold, hard currency to hers of raw, untamed emotion. He walked not with arrogance, but with a staggering vulnerability that no one in that room had ever seen from him before. He stopped when he reached the piano, standing before Stella, who looked up at him, her hands still resting in her lap, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face, as if trying to understand the impossible thing she had just done to him. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked sound came out. He swallowed, the effort visible to everyone. When he finally found his voice, it was not the confident, commanding tone of a CEO. It was a hoarse, broken whisper, raw with an emotion he couldn't name. You. He breathed out the word ragged. You actually did it. It wasn't praise. It was a confession, an admission of a defeat so total, so absolute, it had remade him in a single moment. And then he did something that sent a tidal wave of shock through the entire ballroom. In front of the city's most powerful and influential people, in front of the cameras and the critics, Julian Gray, a man who had never bowed to anyone or anything in his life, slowly, deliberately sank to one knee. He knelt before the forgotten pianist in the simple blue dress. The collective gasp of the room was sharp and sudden. He looked up at her, his eyes, once so cold, now burning with a desperate, terrifying sincerity. The cynical game was over. The arrogant challenge had dissolved into a moment of pure, unscripted truth. "Stella," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "will you marry me?" Stella stared down at the man kneeling before her, and for a moment her mind went completely blank. The roar in her ears was not the sound of the crowd, but the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by the emotional exhaustion of her performance. The question, "Will you marry me?" hung in the space between them, so absurd, so impossible, that she felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her chest. This had to be the final, most devastating twist in his cruel game. He would let her agree, only to stand up, laugh, and expose her as a fool who believed in fairy tales. She braced herself for the impact of the humiliation, but then she truly looked at him. She looked past the impeccable suit, past the name that commanded empires, and into his eyes, and what she saw there stopped her heart. The cold, calculating steel was gone, melted away. In its place was a raw, unguarded vulnerability, a desperate sincerity that was as terrifying as it was undeniable. She saw the lonely boy from the silent mansion. She saw a man who had been so starved for a single, genuine feeling that when he finally felt one, it had brought him to his knees. He wasn't playing a game anymore. He had lost the ability to. In that moment, Stella understood that his insane, impulsive question was not an act of arrogance, but an act of pure, unadulterated desperation. He was a drowning man, and her music had been the first breath of air he'd had in years. Logic screamed at her to refuse, to run from this beautiful, broken man, an impossible situation he had created. But Stella had not been guided by logic all night. She was guided by a deeper instinct, a feeling in her soul that had been reawakened. This moment, this bizarre, earth-shattering connection, was born from her music, born from her truth. To deny it would be to deny the most honest part of herself. Tears, hot and silent, began to well in her eyes and trace paths down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness or joy, but profound, overwhelming catharsis. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the hope she had poured into the piano had led her to this. To him, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, she gave a single, deliberate nod. It was the quietest yes ever uttered, but it shattered the silence of the ballroom like a thunderclap. For a beat, the crowd remained frozen in disbelief. Then the spell broke. The room erupted. A wave of thunderous applause, cheers, and astonished shouts crashed down from all sides. It wasn't the polite, restrained clapping of a charity gala. It was a roaring, emotional ovation. They were no longer applauding a pianist or a billionaire. They were applauding a miracle. And in the center of that roaring storm, Julian remained on one knee, looking up at the crying woman who had, with a simple melody, just changed his entire world.